Soon after the Liberal election victory, entities associated with Prime Minister Mark Carney's previous company, Brookfield Asset Management, sought his help.
Initial skepticism towards proportional tariffs by business leaders like Shopify's Tobi Lutke and Rumble's Chris Pavlovski has proven correct now that the Carney government has exempted most U.S. goods from its levies.
In an initiative aimed at, quote, confronting anti-black racism, the city of Toronto is establishing a separate homeless shelter exclusively for Black Canadians. Hello Canada, it's Friday, May 30th, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin, Dzsurdzsa.
And I'm Clayton, DeMaine.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. Within days of the Liberals' election win, companies linked to Brookfield Asset Management, the former employer of Prime Minister Mark Carney, started requesting his assistance. Two Brookfield-owned oil and gas firms were among 38 signatories of an open letter to Mark Carney on April 30th, requesting accelerated resource development through eased regulations and faster approvals. According to the Investigative Journalism Foundation, federal records show that Brandon Anderson, CEO of Brookfield-owned North River Midstream Incorporated, contacted the Prime Minister for the first time in his lobbying career. North River later reported that its outreach was aimed at, quote, asking the government to consider North River in their investment decisions. The company told reporters that the open letter was its only communication with Carney. Before the election, Anderson's appeal likely wouldn't have reached Carney through Brookfield networks. But as Prime Minister, Carney's past connections with Brookfield and its subsidiaries raised questions. Until January, Carney chaired Brookfield, which manages more than $1 trillion in assets, including ownership of North River through Brookfield Infrastructure Partners. Clayton, obviously Carney's ties to Brookfield were a huge issue during the election campaign. That seems to have died down a little bit, but here he is as Prime Minister. Has Carney disclosed his financial assets yet, including investments he has with Brookfield? And when will Canadians get a full picture of his invested interests now that he's leading the country?
In a way, yes, Carney disclosed his financial assets to the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner during the election campaign. And according to Canada's Conflict of Interest Act, public office holders are required to submit their confidential report with their assets, liabilities, and income within 60 days of assuming office. You won't find an exact dollar figure when those records are released to the public, but if there are any public holdings, they will be in the report. After that, the Ethics Commissioner sends back a summary of his disclosure, and Carney, along with every other elected official, must sign the summary. After that, the Ethics Commissioner sends back a summary of his disclosure, and Carney must sign the summary, which is then released to the public. The problem is that his publicly traded assets went into a blind trust. So when the public does see his conflict of interest summary, they won't even see what assets he's invested in. If the commissioner finds something that he thinks Carney needs to divest from or sell due to a conflict of interest, the commissioner may ask Carney to do so. The ethics commissioner can also inform Carney that he needs to recuse himself on certain files, which would mean the Prime Minister would have to leave the room anytime certain topics were discussed by his government. If you recall, during the campaign while in the UK, Carney snapped at reporters flippantly, saying what possible conflicts of interest could there be. The next day, and none of it, Carney admitted that there would probably be some topic the commissioner tells him he'll have to recuse himself from. What began as a bold show of economic nationalism in the form of tit-for-tat retaliatory tariffs against the U.S. has ended in a quiet retreat for Prime Minister Mark Carney and his government. Today, voices initially critical of dollar-for-dollar retaliation, like Shopify's CEO Tobi Lutke and Rumble's CEO Chris Pavlovski, are vindicated. Retaliatory tariffs were a harebrained idea from the start. When Carney stood at a podium in February 2025 and declared that Canada would hit back dollar for dollar against U.S. tariffs, many Canadians applauded. Just a few months later, the smoke has cleared and political posturing has given way to economic reality. During his inaugural question period yesterday as Prime Minister, Carney faced sharp criticism from interim Conservative opposition leader Andrew Scheer. Scheer accused Carney of misleading Canadians by lifting most retaliatory tariffs during the April election without public disclosure until May. Carney's response, that remaining tariffs had, quote, maximum impact on the US while sparing Canadians, rang hollow when Oxford Economics revealed on May 15th that exemptions had nullified nearly all levies, and the Canadian economy was still headed for recession. Finance Minister Francois-Philippe Champagne scrambled to defend the policy on May 17th, insisting on X that 70% of the $60 billion in tariffs imposed in March remained active. Yet Oxford's report contradicted this, showing exemptions for manufacturing, health, and safety goods had gutted the tariffs' impact. These developments didn't come out of nowhere. Many warned against this course of action from the beginning, not from a position of weakness, but out of economic realism that was obvious to all except those hoping to score political goals. Shopify CEO Tobi Lutke, as early as February 1st, blasted the initial counter-tariff plans, saying, "Leadership is about doing what's right, not what is popular, and hitting back will not lead to anything good. America will shrug it off. Canada will decline." Chris Pavlovski, CEO of Rumble, offered a similarly blunt assessment, writing, quote, "Canada has leaders that want to pretend to be tough. Trump will outplay all of them and already has." So what changed for Ottawa? Carney met with Trump on May 6th at the White House, soon after the order to nullify tariffs went public, Lutke wrote. So, Cosmin, you wrote this analysis piece. As the election period elbows up, nationalism fizzles away with Carney's approach and policies. Looking back, were there other voices warning that retaliatory tariffs were not the right way forward for Canada?
Yeah, in the political field, I would say without a doubt that Alberta Premier Danielle Smith was the most clear-headed about this from the start. As early as January, she was advocating for diplomacy over retaliation. She recognized that the American economy was way larger than that of Canada's, and it would cause irreparable damage to Canada's economy to go towards dollar for dollar tariffs, retaliatory tariffs against US President Donald Trump's measures. And if we recall back, she was actually facing enemies on both sides of the spectrum because, on the one hand, Donald Trump was put a tariff. It was a lower tariff than the other tariffs. It was a 10% tariffs on Alberta's oil industry. And on the other hand, you had people in Ottawa, you had Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at the time, as well as Ontario Premier Doug Ford, suggesting to use Alberta's energy industry as a bargaining chip to pressure the U.S. to walk back on some of its tariffs. So instead, Danielle Smith stood firm and she opposed any use of Alberta's oil and gas industry to counter U.S. tariffs. But she also engaged directly with U.S. officials. She was one of the first people to go out there, first political Canadian leaders to go out there and meet with the U.S. administration and try to negotiate better terms and to ease the trade pressures that were going on. Additionally, she promoted a positive vision for Alberta, Canada as well, and promoted economic cooperation with the United States instead of retaliation and the trade war. And in many ways, she too has been vindicated because a lot of the things she stood for are clearly turning out to be true when it comes to the situation we're in right now. And Carney's tacit admission that the tariffs didn't work, and they really do just seem like a political ploy for popularity. And as I mentioned in the article, it wasn't only Carney who was endorsing dollar-for-dollar tariffs. It was Pierre Poilievre as well during the campaign. He put out a statement calling for dollar-for-dollar tariffs. This was a slogan that was really, a few weeks into that campaign, everybody was talking about dollar-for-dollar tariffs. But what good have they done for Canada? Not very much. The city of Toronto is in the process of establishing a segregated homeless shelter only for Black Canadians in an effort to, quote, confront anti-Black racism. City staff are giving, quote, Black mandated nonprofit organizations until May 30th to apply to operate a homeless shelter for Black Torontonians. These, quote, Black mandated or B3 organizations are defined as having a majority of paid staff and board members who identify as Black, an organization whose mandate explicitly seeks to serve Black communities and whose organization primarily services Black people. Nonprofits with no experience running a homeless shelter are welcome to apply, merely having to demonstrate to the city that the organization has experience serving homeless Black people. However, applicant organizations are evaluated based on their capacity to operate a homeless shelter for Black people, including possible past experiences operating a shelter. The city requires the successful applicant to provide a number of, quote, culturally appropriate services to shelter clients. These supports include culturally appropriate hygiene products, culturally appropriate food and nutrition, culturally safe spaces, and culturally appropriate healthcare. The successful applicant is also required to work from, quote, trauma-informed and equity-focused lenses in providing services to clients. The city will hold the shelter's operators to certain quality standards, requiring the facility to operate 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, maintain a 1-to-20 staff-to-client ratio, provide free Wi-Fi access for staff and clients, and include an outdoor space for pets and service animals. While the shelter is slated to serve those who self-identify as Black, referring to Black Canadians, African Canadians, and people of African descent, it is unclear whether the shelter would be willing to accept homeless people who are not Black or cast them aside instead. Once a location for the shelter is secured, the facility will be scheduled to open within 3 to 5 years and accommodate between 70 to 100 homeless clients. True North reached out to the city of Toronto for comment, though no response was given. Clayton, I would say it's not unusual for Toronto to have services for, quote, Black identifying people, these exclusive services. I recall there was even theater performances that were in the news that mandated Black identifying only audiences. Now, how legal is this? Because you would think that this violates human rights laws in Canada at large, but also perhaps Ontario. What's the legality of specifying specific spaces like this on exclusionary grounds, preventing people who are of other races or don't identify as Black from accessing?
Well, Cosmin, you're right to bring up the Human Rights Code. In both the national and the Ontario Human Rights Code, discrimination based on race and skin color is, of course, not allowed, not acceptable in Canada. And there might be a case to be made if any civil liberties groups were keen on taking the city of Toronto to court based on this, but it would likely have to be challenged through the courts in order to prevent it from happening. The reality is racial discrimination in the pursuit of social justice has become normalized in Canada. Just last year in Toronto, the Toronto Metropolitan University set out quotas vowing to accept 75% of its new medical students from what it called equity-deserving groups. People from these groups, including Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBT, identifying people, and people from impoverished backgrounds, weren't required to achieve the same 3.3 grade point average that people from the general stream of applicants had to. All they would have to do is write an essay about how their particular background disadvantaged them and led them to not being able to achieve the same academic success as those non-equity deserving people. After lots of media attention and public discourse, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, eventually criticized the school publicly, and the school said they would no longer enforce the quotas, though those segregated streams would remain available. Before I started working at True North, I was actually sent an email from a worker at the City of Toronto in a homeless shelter. He, of course, didn't want to be identified, but it was an article that was being sent out to staffers that said decolonize the sidewalks, and it advocated for pushing white people off of the sidewalk if they didn't move out of a person of color's way. But we've seen race-based tree planting programs in Ottawa and higher price tickets for white people at family-friendly dances in Montreal. I suspect the City of Toronto would follow in the footsteps of one librarian in British Columbia who actually got an exemption to the Human Rights Code so that she could hire only persons of color. And she even bragged that she threw out any resumes from white applicants. So you'd think racial discrimination was banned in Canada, but if public businesses can become exempt from human rights, it's unclear what is actually permissible in Canada in that regard anymore.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.